Groundhog Day for Norwich City. Another defeat leaves their playoff chances hanging by a thread. A 1-0 defeat to Sheffield United at Carrow Road on Saturday. Plenty more to discuss, and I feel a lot of old ground left to recover. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast. I'm your host, Connor Southwell, joined by Seaman to my right, Paddy, Davitt to my left, and we are bringing this show to you in association with Future Radio as well. You can listen to it on there on Wednesday nights. Mr. Davitt, where to start other than saying that was all very predictable, wasn't it?
Sadly, it was, and more of the same. You know, the stats tell their own story, but the one that sticks in my head, put it in my pointers, was that is now 8 league defeats at Carrow Road this season, and they've won 8 as well. So, you know, any team with any aspirations to either go up automatically or, as it has been reset by David Wagner after the Stoke draw, playoffs, 8 home defeats is, it leads to mediocrity, and that's unfortunately what we have now with this group of players. David Wagner, who we see behind us, is saying nothing has been decided after what we've seen a few hours earlier. But I think we all felt before this game, and now more evidence today, that this group of players are not good enough, and that there's some major revamping / rebuilding needed in the summer. But you know, we'll probably get into that in due course. There'll be plenty of time between now and the summer to really drill into what next. In the here and now, you know, the manner of the defeat, 92nd minute before Marquinhos has a shot on target. I mean, that's just frankly it's unacceptable, and we'll get into obviously the reasons why. But fundamentally, I think more evidence against the team who I think have gone 6 points clear of Middlesbrough now after their result of Middlesbrough's defeat at Huddersfield. A team who are second in the table, seemingly following Burnley into the Premier League. And they were just better in all facets of the game today. And they looked streetwise, they were resilient, they were uncompromising when they needed to. Norwich don't possess any of those traits, and unfortunately, if you don't have those in the Championship, that's a prerequisite to be fighting out at the top end of the table. And it's really just sad to acknowledge, but this group have reached the end of the road, and as I say, now it would seem Wagner is going to be tasked with sifting the wheat from the chaff, and somehow or other, with support from above and support from the terraces, trying to turn this team and club around for me, because it's very end of an era, and we saw that, I think, again today. You know, where Sheffield United markedly better than Norwich? No, but they just look like a group of players who are basically heading in the right direction, whereas unfortunately the group in yellow and green, they look like they've probably reached the end of the road, some of them. So, you know, big summer ahead, but in the here and now, I guess, while they're still not mathematically out of the playoff picture, we'll press on. But all I'd say is, can you, on the evidence what you've seen today, on the evidence of what we saw here again previously against Sunderland and in between Huddersfield and Stoke, would you back this group to go to Blackburn now on Good Friday and then Rotherham here on Easter Monday and get 6 points? I certainly wouldn't.
No, and for me as well, on the playoff debate, this is going to sound very negative and very defeatist, I know, but it's a bit like, to what end? This group might finish 6th, but what's the point almost? Because you're then probably going to have 2 legs. It's likely going to be against Middlesbrough or Luton. Norwich get beat in both those legs, don't they, pretty convincingly on the evidence of what we've seen so far this season. And that's probably why I probably feel, and I'm sure a lot of fans and listeners to this will feel, and obviously our readers as well, pretty wary, exasperated at the current situation, Sam, because we can talk about rebuilds and we can talk about this group. We've already kind of covered the main topics, really. It's just the fundamentals of it, and I guess the reality that this group that was compiled for quite a bit of money, quite a considerable amount of money. We could go through the team, but you've got Ben Gibson, who's was worth £8 million. They spent money on Christos Schollis, on Josh Sargent, players in this team who should be performing, and ultimately you've got a pretty fatal concoction there of players who aren't as good as they used to be, players who haven't fulfilled their potential, and players who perhaps aren't as good as perhaps they needed to be this season. Do you understand that wariness and that kind of exasperation that a lot of Norwich fans feel? Because we were in the stadium today it was only 1-0. It was around 75 minutes and the place was emptying.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to our colleague Adam earlier today, and I was saying that even if I wasn't in this job and I was just back in the position of being a fan that, paid to go week in, week out, I don't think I would be particularly enthused by what I was seeing. I certainly wouldn't be excited by it, and I maybe would be inclined to stop putting my hand in my pocket and paying to watch this team, because it's a really, really difficult time to be a Norwich City supporter, because even if they had been promoted, the expectation and the discussion, even at the start of the season when things were going relatively well results-wise, was still how are things going to look in the Premier League and how are Norwich going to make a success of themselves there. And if the bar is that high and if the goal is achieving in that division, how bad and how disappointing does it feel to now be in a situation where they're clamouring for an opportunity to even give themselves a chance in the playoffs. And as you outlined earlier, even if they get there, they're probably not going to end up in the Premier League next season. So they're so far away from what they've aimed for publicly, by the way, not just behind the scenes, and this isn't just our interpretation of what the club will want. Their messaging has been the goal this season was to go back to the Premier League, and right now it feels like they're a far way away from that. And when you set the bar that high, which rightfully they should have done, by the way, because after 2 consecutive promotions, they should really be giving themselves a chance at establishing themselves in the Premier League. You just wonder where they go from here, really, because I don't know if anybody in that stadium this afternoon was thinking Norwich are on the way to Premier League safety and sustainability. I think most of them were worrying about going the other way, actually, and they were worrying about whether Norwich will even be competing for promotion next season, because you look at the squad they've got now, and added to the fact that most of those players are declining is the fact that their best one is probably going to leave this summer, especially if they don't get promoted. In fact, I'd say if they don't get promoted, it's very near certainty that Tamer Pukki won't be here next season. And there are a number of players sort of in that bracket, and you look at it and just think, what sort of championship side are they going to be next season? And for me, it's a mid-table side at best, unless they do some absolutely incredible recruitment work in the summer. And recent evidence on that front doesn't suggest that they will. So it certainly feels like a very bleak time to be a Norwich fan. And, I don't blame any pessimists whatsoever. The fact that they still turn out in relative numbers, compared to the Championship, it's still incredible attendances. I think the official one today was 26,801, which is unbelievable.
Well remembered.
Yeah, thanks very much. You write it down enough times.
I've already forgotten everything that happened, to be honest. So.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a difficult time for them, and fair play for still putting their hand in their pocket. I think it's 20,000 season tickets sold already, and that shows just how incredible this fan base is, and they deserve to be rewarded more than they have in recent weeks. Yes,
they do, and look, we could sit here and we could dissect the game. I think to an extent that's a little bit futile, because I think we would all draw the same conclusion. Sheffield, shout if you disagree, but Sheffield United were the better team. They certainly had the better chances. They hit the bar in the first half with a header. Billy Sharp hit the bar post yeah. In the second with what was a really good strike. The goal was onside. I think replays have suggested that to be the case, although David Wagner was a little bit peeved with a pass in the build-up, I think, although I haven't necessarily seen that back, so can't really comment on that at this stage. And yes, he's probably right. You can't really fault the work rate. It's a quality point. But I guess the point underpinning it all, Paddy, and this is probably the point that we've been at all season with this Norwich City group, is that we know the levels can be so much higher than this. Injuries or no injuries, and I know David Wagner would probably counterpoint that they've got Kieran Dowell out, they've got Onel Hernandez out, they've got key attacking players out. Although beyond those two, I would maybe argue that there's not too many who have been frontline options this season anyway. But the point is, 4 games ago, Norwich went to Millwall, they recorded a 3-2 win. They did it in relative, I wouldn't say comfort, but certainly the way that they did it offered encouragement in terms of their grit, their character, the way that they played, that ability to raise their levels to beat a side in and around them. And at that point, we were probably talking about top 6, or some people were talking, I don't think we were necessarily, but I think some people were talking about top 6 being a little bit of it's going to happen. That was kind of decided. Yet since that, they've lost 1-0 to Sunderland, drawn at Huddersfield, drawn 0-0 at Stoke in pretty horrendous circumstances, and obviously lost here today against Sheffield United. They've had 2 shots in 88 minutes of football across the last 2 games. They've scored 1 goal, which came against Huddersfield. I mean, the drop-off from that Millwall game has been so incredible. And that, in a way, encapsulates this season, that kind of idea that this Norwich group can produce better, and we all know they can, and yet we find ourselves in a run like this where everyone's probably expecting a little bit more than what they've seen. We all feel probably a little bit undersold.
Yeah, but I mean, you've narrowed that down to Millwall onwards, but effectively that is this season for this group of players under 2 different managements. It's worth stressing. For any who felt all the ills were at the door of Dean Smith and Shakespeare and Bramley and Alan Russell maybe later, has proved not to be the case. But flattering to deceive is probably the best phrase, really, for if you want to put a label on this season for Norwich City, that they are seemingly capable of better, because in small samples we've seen it, and most recently that is the Millwall game. And isn't all on the players. I think Wagner needs to have a good look at how he set them up today, particularly. And it's not been wise after the event. We did the team news before the game and was slightly at a loss to see where he was going with that setup. And for me, Millwall is a watershed, because that was the game where Gabi Zara, the match winner that day, who was excellent. I mean, Wagner labelled that display from him as, a typical British midfielder, and that was meant as a compliment in the sense of that he married. My take on it was that he married the technical and the quality elements with that robustness, competitive edge that you need in this league, particularly, but English football more broadly. And that day we saw him with Sorensen and McLean behind him, and he was given that licence to be basically devastating in and around the opposition penalty box. Well, since then, by and large, and we saw it again today, effectively out of possession in the first half at least, he was in a central 4 alongside Josh Sargent. More often than not, he was picking it up off the back 4 in his own box. That for me isn't, particularly then when you overlay that with Pookie, Sargent, Ida. Last 11 games, I know they haven't played them all, they've all had their injury issues. 1 goal from that collective in the last 11 games.
Is that about them, though? Is that about the wider structure? I guess
them.
That's the debate that a lot of people are having at the moment.
Obviously, it is about the structure and the setup, which overlays, as I say, why Zara, for me, is playing in the wrong position now. If you want to get the maximum out of him and in his goal-scoring and his assist-making capabilities. But it is also about those individuals. They're better than they've shown in this period. Pookie and Sargent they raced to 11 goals, 10, 11 goals each. And, since the turn of the year, it's been a tale of woe. As I say, interspersed with injuries, and Ida as well in that mix. But for me today, I think Wagner has to answer some serious questions, how he set them up. I think he was far too easy. I mean, the first half, it was seemingly the only attacking option or idea they had was for Hanley or Gibson to hit Pookie long, and invariably over his head and over John Egan, and it rolled through to the keeper. It was just painful to watch, really. So, by all manner of means, focusing on the players, but I do think today, especially the head coach, needs to have a look at what he was striving to do and tactically how he went about it, because I thought it was far too easy for Sheffield United. And to repeat what I said in my intro, if you're mustering the one shot or your first shot on target 92 minutes in, clearly you have set up in the wrong way, or the personnel you've selected haven't delivered. That's inarguable. You cannot contend anything else. And it is frustrating. It is really frustrating to bring that right back to your point, Connor, which is this group of players I think are capable of better. And that was the subtext to a lot of Dean Smith this season, that he wasn't getting the most out of a group of players who we all felt were capable of better. You have to say Wagner probably allowing for the injury issues, and Dowell with every passing game and every passing week looks a huge miss now in terms of the impact he was having in the early Wagner reign. So that's a hand he's been dealt with. But I do think Wagner isn't, certainly in these post-Millwall 4 games, 2 points from 12. All of those games they should have been conceivably winning for me. Stoke away, maybe not, less so, but I don't think Wagner is extracting the optimum from the available resource. And if he's not really coming up to the mark, and the players aren't coming up to the mark, is it any wonder that we now have a playoff bid in name only and a promotion push, which is effectively stalled. And I think we'll probably, unless something dramatically changes by the time we get the other side of, well, certainly Middlesbrough, which is coming on the horizon after Easter, then I think we'll very much definitely be parking 22, 23 and trying to consign it to the history books rather swiftly.
Forget consign it to history books. I'm throwing it in the bin and setting fire to it. That's the way this season's gone. There was an interesting quote from Chris Wilder, who, if you've missed it, is this week's Watford manager. They lost today at Luton by 2-0, and he spoke a bit about the hunger or lack of hunger within his group, and spoke about a cultural reset, which is really interesting because they're 2 points behind Norwich City. So if you're putting Norwich in the playoff picture, we're probably putting Watford in it as well, to the point where I did something for Sky in the international break, and Watford were represented, and that was supposedly a playoff debate. So by virtue of that, I guess we're including them. But I guess there's some interesting similarity, not necessarily in terms of how the clubs operate, but in terms of how their seasons have developed in terms of expectation and this kind of wedge between expectation and reality. Are Norwich in the same boat? Do they need a bit of a cultural reset and a bit of the way I described it, I think in my verdict today, was a bit of realignment, a bit of this maybe clarity over what the plan is? Because I think when you hear people speak about Norwich who work for the club, we hear a lot about striving to be a Premier League club and perhaps a little less detail on the actual plan to get there, which perhaps, again, we're comparing them probably against all the versions of themselves, hasn't necessarily been the case. So is it a cultural reset that we're talking about? Reset's a word that's been bandied about a lot. Are we talking about playing overhaul, cultural reset, both of them? Or what do you kind of think?
Yeah, I think it probably is both of them, to be honest, because if Norwich had the appropriate players for a promotion push, and had it been quite as easy as they maybe thought it was going to be going into the season, I think the players would have got them higher than they currently are. Make no doubt about it. Having a good culture and inspiring good work from the players and everyone being in a positive mood and happy does make a difference for sure. And maybe it would have been the couple of points that would have taken them from third to second, but it's not going to be the thing that takes you from seventh and 4 points away from the playoff places to the automatic promotion, which I think they thought they could very reasonably achieve at the start of the season. I think it's probably underlined how important that stuff was, how much we've talked about it this season, because prior to probably the Daniel Farker era, I doubt very much that there were too many discussions about culture or behind the scenes on the PinkUn podcast, and now it seems like every week we're talking about how important that is and how sad and frustrating it is that that's declined so much. So I think it certainly is a very big thing, but in terms of those comparisons with Watford, I think there are a few things that probably contribute to that and leave the clubs in a similar situation, and one of them is that they're both on a pretty up and down yo-yo cycle, and like I mentioned earlier, the very baseline in the Championship is getting promoted. So how do you create a positive feeling about the club? How do you have a positive culture when the only thing you can do is meet expectations? They can't really do much more than that while they're in the Championship, right? So for the whole of this year, the only thing they could really be was satisfactory because of that situation and that assumption, especially from the outside and from external sources, that they will be promoted. And I think that's a problem. And I also think a big problem is the chasm between the Premier League at the moment and the Championship, because making that step from being promoted to being an established club is so hard, and you have to get it so right. And that's why I think rightfully clubs like Brentford, who seem to be doing it on a long-term basis, Fulham, who hopefully for them are starting that process. It's why they've got so many plaudits and why it's fair that that's what they've got, because it's now increasingly a really, really difficult task to bridge that gap. So while Norwich are trying to do it, and I hope this doesn't sound like me making excuses for them or providing mitigation, they should have done it better, but it is getting an increasingly difficult task, and that's why everyone feels worn out, I think, because they know what's on the horizon, even if they achieve the goal that they've got. So, yeah, I think inside the club, the culture certainly does need improving, and it doesn't feel like a happy place to be. Carrow Road, for me, since I started going there when I was, I think, 8, so like 12 years ago was the first time I went to Carrow Road. This is the most toxic it's felt to me, and the saddest place to be it's been for me since I started going there. So yeah, definitely within the club it feels like there needs to be some sort of reset and some sort of improvement, but I think the external factors are making it more and more difficult to be positive as a Norwich fan, player, member of staff. So I think there are a few factors going into it, really.
Yeah, we recorded a podcast last week, but I'm conscious that I don't want to do too much stuff on the reset because we've got 7 shows left to do this season, so we've got plenty of time to kind of dissect and properly inquest it. And obviously, of course, there is a chance, however slim you might feel, that Norwich could still get promoted this year. So it's probably not worth us going through all of that in minute detail. I won't go into it now, but I've got various concerns about what a rebuild would actually look like, but I'll leave you waiting and wanting more on that. We recorded a podcast last week, and we looked at the 8 games, but probably the 4 really after this break, which was obviously Sheffield United, which has ended in defeat. I probably felt they needed to win it today. I think you probably felt the same. Obviously they haven't, but circumstances next week means, and we'll come on to this towards the end of the podcast, but they go to Blackburn. Millwall have Luton as well on Good Friday, so there is a realistic prospect that if Norwich City could, and could is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, I know, but they could win at Ewood Park, and Millwall could lose at Luton. Both of those, I would say, are relative. I mean, they're not impossible, and that would suddenly move them within 1 point of 5th and 6th again, and so it becomes open again. So that's why I'm very conscious that we don't go into a kind of rebuild, reset, and sort of use up all of our material and have nothing to speak about for 7 weeks. But we said in that podcast it would take probably 4 wins, 5 wins from 8.
A few more than that, Connor. I think we decide on about 6.
I think you said 6, but I think 5.
Well, you said 5 would get you to. I mean, it's irrelevant now because they haven't got one today. But I thought 5 would leave them relying on other teams, which may be the case now anyway. But whereas I thought 6 would control their destiny. So,
but the bottom line is
6 from 7. Don't see it.
Yeah, and this group is, I'd say 5 from 7 is tough with the way this group they don't score goals, and maybe that's the issue that we need to raise, right? I think you've got 3 strikers who haven't scored in 11 games. Adam Ida's scored once all season, albeit he was playing in a wider role. Teemu Pukki, I think, largely doesn't look quite as maybe switched on as what he has done in the past, and there's obviously a contractual situation there, and I'm sure lots of people will have their own say on that. Josh Sargent hasn't quite looked the same player since he returned from the World Cup. There's been some injuries there as well, so mitigation perhaps. But it is a major issue. This, and for people who are watching on YouTube, we've got a headline behind us, which is David Wagner talking about his side's inability in front of goal. But it does come back to that structural point, doesn't it? And we've got Ben Lee, who does a brilliant column for us every Monday, Tuesday, dissecting the tactics that Norwich have used at the weekend. And there's a theme really about the way they build up and kind of this gaping hole that they leave in the middle of the pitch. And essentially, I mean, Ben Gibson spoke about it after the game, really. You're then forced to go a bit more direct, and you're playing direct to Teemu Pukki, Josh Sargent, who is big but isn't massively physical or aerial in that regard. He's not someone who scores a high amount of headers or is particularly geared that way. Marquinhos obviously on the right, and Adam Ida. It's difficult to see how this Norwich City team are going to score goals at the moment, and it links to that point that you referenced about Kieran Dowell. I know players tend to get better when they're not involved, but he does feel like a massive miss at the moment, because you go back to when Norwich City were playing well under David Wagner. Him on the right and Onel Hernandez on the left, they were a key part of it.
Yeah, and that it is worth stressing. It isn't just about Dowell. I think Hernandez as well. I think now you're seeing, in their own very different and unique ways, but how they were facilitators and how they were connecting to. I mean, my mind goes back to the Coventry away game, which was just a carnival of counter-attacking football, and Dowell was pivotal. Hernandez scored that day. Sargent scored. But the movement and the interchange, and part of that might have been Coventry played into their hands a little bit. But again, that day we went away thinking, because that was one of the maybe criticisms at Dean Smith, that his in-game changes, his ability to almost get ahead of the tactical curve against his direct opponent and to basically gain the upper hand. Well, Wagner did that, that day particularly. And even then when Coventry came back, half-time, he's deconstructed it. They were far more solid and played out that second half at the CBS with very few alarms, and obviously added to their tally in the end. Kieran Dowell, as it comes back to me now, I think finished the scoring that day. But where's that gone? Where has that gone? I know no Dowell, I know no Hernandez, but I don't want to labour the point. But for me, Wagner is now not ahead of the curve in these games. You know, Tony Mowbray outwitted him in the Sunderland game down here tactically. Tony Mowbray admitted that this Norwich team give you chances. You know, that there is. I'd imagine it's still the case that stat about most individual defensive errors in the league, Norwich City. Again, spanning two different managements, but still same players. And essentially, if you can turn the ball over high within a pass, you're having a shooting opportunity, and that's how the game was decided against Sunderland. And I've felt in the last 2 or 3 games as well. Today, I don't think he got the upper hand with Heckingbottom in terms of how that game was constructed.
And Sheffield United didn't press in the same way that we've seen teams do against Norwich.
So, you know, I just find it a little bit strange, really, and off-putting, because we have seen Wagner be very proactive and, as I say, in real time deconstruct the problems he was facing in those first few games. And he might just turn around and say simply, well, you know, you've got Kieran Dowell on the pitch, you've got Onel Hernandez on the pitch, you've got a better chance of deconstructing the issues, and maybe that's what it boils down to. Now we're realising the importance of those two in his style of play and what he wants to do. And Dowell particularly, that connector between the two centre-backs and 3/4 players up the top end of the pitch, instead of aimlessly hitting balls into channels over the heads of Pukki, Sargent, Ida. With Dowell, you've got the cleverness to get in the half spaces, get on the half turn and bring others into play. And I think it's increasingly apparent that Kieran Dowell needs to remain beyond the end of this contract. They need to get him signed up and then build a team around him almost, I think, next season, because, you know, what we've seen in the last 4 games, it's crying out for that type of clever midfield operator. Again, Núñez rolled his ankle yesterday in training. He was deprived his services. That may have helped him, but, and again, not being wise after the event, but when I saw a front 3 and Pukki of Sargent, Ida, and, you know, they're functional forwards for me. They're not players with the cleverness on the ball to play the style of football which would give Norwich a degree of control. I think they probably have shaded the possession stats again today, but the way Norwich build up in the last 2 or 3 games, it's not a long-term recipe for success for me. You know, it's almost like they're falling between 2 stools, and maybe 1 or 2 of those games where they found it harder going, playing the style Wagner went. Has he just tried to go a little bit more direct and sort of veer away from that? But the upshot is they're not winning games, they're not playing well, they're not scoring goals. So for me, I think he needs to maybe go back to a bit more to what we saw in the Preston and Coventry type of games, and that for me is certainly getting Zara higher up the pitch, but also I think the moment has come now. If Pukki isn't part of this moving forward, it might be time to say, well, we'll put you to the side and we need to go with Sargent and Ida and incorporate them in a spearhead that actually does give Norwich a bit of a cutting edge, because there is no cutting edge in these last 3 or 4 games. Again, Marquinhos, I'm not sure he offered too much for me. Again,
he had the shot on target. That was a wonderful shot on target.
Yeah, after 92 minutes. Yeah, he didn't do too much in the previous 91 minutes. And that's increasingly looking a piece of business that isn't going to pay off in the way that anybody would have hoped. You roll the dice, sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't feel like that's going to pay off. And the frustration now in the much narrower confines of this season, don't think Dowell's going to be back much before the Blackpool game. Hernandez, well, Wagner said on Friday, the other side of Easter, but that's a bit open-ended. So he's really going to have to come from the players he's got currently, and we wait to see how long Núñez may be out for. Hopefully that's not too serious, but you know, I feel it's probably, we've already reached the crossroads where he needs to take some tough decisions in the forward areas of the pitch, particularly because it feels a bit dysfunctional now. What Norwich are trying to do isn't paying off, to try and do something different. And you know, it was noticeable that Abu Kamara got a first taste of it at senior level in the second half. Jolis finished the game on the pitch. Liam Gibbs was on the pitch by the end. You know, is that almost a very clear signal from Wagner that the dial's beginning to turn? And that process may get accelerated now if, as we all fear, the results continue in this patchy vein between now and, well, certainly Middlesbrough, because if they do, then the game will be up anyway, and then it will be full steam ahead to next season.
Yeah, they just don't have any creativity, do they? And I guess, I mean, Kieran Dow wasn't even massively involved before David Wagner took charge, so it is, and this is where we're at, I guess, with the squad. The whole thing just feels very tired, very flat, very unimaginative, not particularly creative.
It's predictable, isn't it? I mean, that first half today.
But I'd say all about today was predictable. I got if I would have wrote down how I saw that game going, it was pretty much that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And if you're Heckingbottom and his assistant Stuart McCall, I mean, you're thinking, is this all they've got? I'm pretty sure they were stood there thinking, well, I think we can deal with this with our centre backs. You know, the towering. I'm not even going to pronounce his name. What's his name, Connor? The 15.
Oh, don't ask me. I have no idea.
But him and Egan, you know, balls. I mean, that's if you could. I'm sure if they sat down and what balls are we happy to deal with in terms of our defenders, it would be long diagonals from, you know, centre backs and Kenny McLean. But which again, you know, I don't want to keep harping on, but for me, Wagner has questions to answer, and this is probably the first time I'm thinking today, looking at that he hasn't come up to scratch for me, and that's a concern. You know, is he now getting weighed down with it a little bit as well? And if so, then, you know, it's clear that this season has gone, and it will be about putting in the building blocks, which, yeah, as you rightly say, we'll park that for now. But that's going to be in one window, particularly a hellishly difficult job to undertake. But that's for the future. And
save it.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time to dissect that. But yeah, no. For me today, we accept the mitigation with the injuries. Absolutely no issue with that. But I still think Norwich and Wagner could have been a lot better than they were today. And the question's why, and why is this now a pattern? 4 games post Millwall, that is a pattern, and it's a regressive pattern. And ultimately, that's why they're, as we sit here tonight, 4 points out of the top 6. And yes, it could tighten up if the scenario you map out next Good Friday played out, but I think we'll be travelling to Ewood Park with hope rather than expectation, won't we?
Not even sure I've
I've
got
not
hope.
got that much hope.
Not even sure I've got hope, to be honest, at this point. Yeah, I don't really I was expecting him today to kind of revert back to what we saw at Millwall, with Sorensen in alongside McLean, Sarah pushed forward, just to try and give them a little bit more control in central areas. You could then, if you wanted to play Adamida on the left, you could play Adamida on the left. And I think it would just give them a bit more forward thrust and a bit more balance and a few more options, and that ability to probably build up a little bit better. But also then, if you want to go a bit more direct, I think you've got Sarah buzzing about who could get on second balls and try and play off that. So that to me felt a bit more of a logical way to go, rather than kind of that. It was a bit more of a 4-2-4 really. It just kind of felt like, I don't want to use it, desperate is the word, but certainly an attempt to try and score goals. But it just didn't. It felt disjointed. It didn't really feel functional. You were basically playing 3 players who want to be on the end of a cross rather than being the players who create a chance or put in the cross. And again, look, he would counter that he doesn't have the bodies or the options to do anything different at the moment, and there's an element of truth in that. But I mean, I've just given an alternative way I think he could have gone today. And to be fair, you lads will back. I was saying this pre-match as well. It's not just with the beauty of hindsight. Sam, let's try and move this forward then a bit, because it is Blackburn next weekend, and for me, I know Paddy thinks it's probably done, and I feel it's done, but I don't think we can say it's properly done until it's done. But a loss at Blackburn, well, anything other than a win at Blackburn really, because a draw would maintain this 4-point cushion that they've got, and obviously if Millwall lost to Luton, they would only then be 3 points, and you're still relying on a 2-game swing. So that's the question, I guess. They need to win next week, don't they? It is kind of do or die. Yeah,
and I think they probably came into this set of 8 games and realised that was the situation, to be honest. I think for most teams who aren't where they want to be coming into the final 8 games, it feels like every match is must win. And I think when David Wagner first came in, he said that he liked the fact that Norwich were sort of chasers and hunters, and when you've got that fresh impetus of a new coach and players who are probably a bit relieved, certainly certain players relieved to move on from a regime that wasn't really working for them, it probably is actually quite nice to be, the team that everybody's looking out for and the team that everybody's excited to watch and things. But now that that's died down a little bit, there certainly isn't any feeling whatsoever of a quote-unquote new manager bounce about Norwich at the moment. I think being in a rut and having to chase is really, really difficult, and it does make every game absolutely vitally important. But for me, it feels slightly reminiscent of the sort of Project Restart period, when it just felt like they had this target. And I remember Daniel Farke said 5 wins, and with every game it was just slipping away, and he had to go into press conferences and say, but it's not done yet, and it's not, and that's basically what we're seeing from Wagner.
It's a bit like having one hand holding onto the top of the cliff and going, I can still pull myself up, and just a finger slipping every minute is kind of what it feels like.
Yeah, no, it's funny actually. Me and my housemate Ollie, we play tennis together, and we have a bit of a joke where if we're match point down, we'll say, "Oh, we're still alive," and that's what it feels like, to be honest, with Norwich at the moment.
Still 0-0. That's the one.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we've all been there, sort of under 13s level.
You're 8-0 down. Come on, lads. Still 0-0.
Still a half to go, sort of thing. But I would be interested to know the sort of split of how many Norwich fans are just keen to get this over with, because. When I was speaking to them after the game, there was definitely more of a vibe of not excited for the rest of the games than, a bit annoying, but back to the grind sort of thing, which is, I'm sure, what David Wagner would ask for. But I think it's fairly unrealistic at this stage to be optimistic about it. It's certainly possible, and maybe Norwich have the players playing at their very, very best to squeeze in one of the worst championships I think we've ever seen. But with the trajectory they're on now, the fixtures coming up, it feels very difficult to see them getting in there. So unless they can produce a big win against Blackburn, maybe somebody gets sent off in the first 10 minutes for them, and it all falls in Norwich's way. And we know what a big win can do for momentum and how that can change things and impact things in the Championship. It's really hard to see them producing on a consistent basis, because I'm not sure we've seen them put 3 good performances together, let alone 7. I don't feel entirely optimistic, but given we're journalists, we can't say now that we can't say 100% that it's over. I'm sure the large majority of Norwich fans sat at home and watching this podcast are saying it absolutely is, and unfortunately that's the situation they're in, and they've put themselves in that situation. So I'm not sure how Wagner really motivates these players, because he's probably been saying we need to win this for weeks now, if not in public, then behind the scenes. So what added motivation can they have from being in a must-win game? Because it's felt like must-win for a long while. So as much as I don't want to bring in more doom and gloom, it feels like you were trying to
you're going to get some positivity in it, it's all right.
Yeah. There we go. So, I think as much as I'd like to bring that positivity now, I can't really, unfortunately. Doing my best, Connor, I'm doing my best.
Yes, and we'll come back to the Easter schedule towards the end, and we'll get your lads' points predictions. I'm going to call it rather than score predictions. So I'll tee you up for that. Well, we're going to try and end on a bit of positivity. So, Paddy, there was some figures released on Friday, which are always released, I think, on the 31st of March, about agent fees, which again probably leans into the narrative around kind of expectation and various aspects of it, which I'll hand over to you on. But the headline figure was, I suppose, that Norwich City spent more on agent fees than any other club in the Championship, which was 4.3 roughly. And I think Watford and Burnley were in and around them, but no one spent more in the Championship than the Norwich City chicken feed in comparison to Premier League, obviously, particularly Chelsea, who I think spent more than the entire EFL on agent fees, which is pretty incredible, but perhaps a little bit unsurprising. Just talk to us a little bit about those figures, because I know there's plenty of mitigation in them. But yeah, just give us your take on that, and I guess the narrative that some people will have around those as well.
Yeah, well, basically these are FA published figures for intermediaries / agent transactions in a 12-month time frame, which spans effectively last summer, so the window following relegation for Norwich from the Premier League, and then the January window, the most recent one. So if you look at those 2 windows, what did Norwich do business-wise? Well, the headline arrivals were the two South American imports, Zara and Nunes. We know, I think it was in the published accounts, that Zara was an initial 6 million outlay in terms of the transfer fee, but, really those two are, plus obviously Isaac Hayden came in, there was a season-long deal there, the finances around that, but other than those, Marquinhos in the most recent window came in from Arsenal, again on a loan deal. There was a few updated contracts in that time frame, Andrew Mbama-Daly notably, I think Tompkinson, some of the other younger professionals, and there was because you get the list of actual transactions, and there was a Todd Cantwell transaction as well.
Seaman as well, I think, wasn't there? Yeah.
So to terminate those contracts, basically there was a transaction which,
and for intermediaries that sometimes help create deals and set up deals.
Exactly. So a lot of strands to pull together, but essentially that, not a huge amount of business, you would say, in terms of signings, but quite a sizable amount of money, and certainly the biggest in the Championship. But to place it in context, the last time they were in the Championship, following on from a Premier League relegation, I think the figure was around about 6.8 million, so considerably lower. But vis-a-vis what their other rivals have spent on agents' fees, intermediary fees in this 12-month period, best in class in that sense. And I guess to follow on what you're saying there about narrative, the narrative will be, well, what have they got for that outlay? What have they got in terms of, spending the most on intermediary fees? And also another caveat, it's not purely the 12-month period we're relating to these two windows. There will be payments due from previous windows and previous sort of add-on triggers with previous intermediaries and agent fees. So it isn't completely all the business they did in these previous two windows, but I'd imagine the majority of that 4.3 million were the two windows we've just most recently concluded. And for a team who are now 7th, 4 points out of the playoffs, with a stated ambition from the club before a ball was kicked to go back immediately to the Premier League, as they had done at the previous two times of asking, well, it all flows into, let's be honest, that the business they've done transfer-wise in these most recent windows isn't up to scratch. Because if it was, they wouldn't be 7th in the table. And for all those accusations you want to make at Norwich, the same apply to Watford, who have spent in this time frame, intermediary-wise, pretty much what Norwich did. And you'd already touched on it earlier. Chris Wilder is coming out and questioning the culture after another defeat earlier today for them at Luton. So, the parallels between Norwich and Watford, and not in a good way, are very clear and evident. And this is another one that, despite seemingly spending quite a considerable amount by Championship standards in the last 12 months, hasn't paid off, certainly at this stage. It may well prove to be, certainly if you look at Zara, and there's already speculation, and has been in the last few weeks, about Premier League clubs looking at him, and obviously when he was in his fertile spell culminating in Millwall, and he obviously did score at Huddersfield afterwards, then yes, maybe those figures being bandied around 20, 25, 30 million pounds worth of player, then it may well prove to be, as we look back on this 12-month time frame, an inspired piece of business. But in the here and now, in the much narrower confines of Norwich's success or otherwise on the pitch in the Championship, it hasn't paid off as of yet. And that isn't all laid at Gabi Sara's door, of course, but as a club, in terms of the business they've done, it's continuing a theme, isn't it? Because, the narrative from the window previously, the previous summer's window, which was the one spanning Championship promotion, Premier League, hopefully sustainability, we all know. We've dissected that window to death, by Norwich's standards, a lavish outlay, 50, 60, 70 million, depending on, where you pitch your tent with the add-ons and attendant clauses, on a series of deals which were singularly not equipping that squad for Premier League sustainability. And as has been proven, certainly with Sargent, with Zolis, Rashica, not even here, out the door, hasn't equipped them to have a good attempt at getting back out of the Championship. So I guess there'll be plenty of Norwich fans questioning again the sporting director who oversees that element of the football operation, and he will speak for himself, I'm sure. But ultimately, the figures from the FA's figures would tell you Norwich have spent as much, if not more, than every other club in the Championship on agents and intermediaries in the last 12 months for a team who are 4 points out of the playoffs and seemingly heading to another season of Championship football. So make of that what you will.
Yeah, and it's a significant outlay as well, particularly for a club like Norwich, where we know every penny. You kind of have to make it count, don't you, in that regard? So all I would add to that is when you go into South America, you get players who can be owned by agents sometimes, who have multiple agents. There's some quite murky water with agents ownership and third party ownership and all of that kind of thing. So that is maybe a pitfall of them going into the market that they're going into. Even though the transfer fees might be smaller, the agent fees might be slightly increased. So all of that's worth adding as well. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't help the narrative whether or not that's justified or not, right? So that's interesting. Sam, any positivity for me? Neil Warnock, that's quite a nice story. He's at it again. I don't know if you've got anything else for me.
Fullbacks were quite good. I thought it was Max Aaron's best performance for a good long while.
He is, in all seriousness, their creativity at the moment, isn't he? He feels like their creative force.
I think I'm struggling to remember too many times they got into the box without him, and yet he had probably 2 or 3 occasions where he burst into there and tried to do something. Probably the end product should be better if he's going to be Norwich City's chief creative player. But I felt, to be honest, he should have had a penalty in the first half, and it feels like one of those where it happens so early in the game it almost gets lost in the narrative a little bit. So perhaps, actually, to be fair, I've stumbled across some positivity and some mitigation that...
Max Aaron should have had a penalty.
Yeah, Max Aaron should have had a penalty 50 minutes before the goal got scored. But I thought Younulis was excellent as well today, to be fair, and I've been fairly critical of him the last few weeks because I think he's a really, really talented player, and I think, to be honest, had things gone slightly better in his Norwich career, perhaps with the team as much as with himself, and also probably with Dean Smith's preference for Brandon Williams over him during that Premier League season, he probably could be playing at a much higher level than Norwich, and I think he's probably got the capabilities. So I probably do expect a lot from him at this level, and he's starting to deliver it over the last couple of weeks. So you're probably looking at that for some positives, maybe some way of raising funds this summer, because it certainly looks like Norwich are
Save it. We're not using it all now. Pad, Coventry got beat. Was it 4-0 in the end?
Exactly, there's a positive. Things could always be worse. 4-0 at home to Alex Neil.
Well, all I would add in seriousness in this race, today, and it's probably why today feels a little bit of a missed opportunity, because Millwall drew, Blackburn lost, Coventry lost. Obviously, West Brom were playing Millwall, so they drew. Interestingly, with them, they have a game in hand, which I think would take them to 60 points, wouldn't it? Because they're on 57.
Who?
West Brom.
Yeah.
So that again would push Norwich further down the. I don't know when their game in hand is or who it's against, off the top of my head. But that is an interest. Obviously, Norwich have to go there as well. So that's an interesting one to keep an eye on. I wouldn't discount them totally. And anything positive?
It's nearly over. It's nearly over. That's a
what,
positive.
This pod or
no? Well, that and the season. Yeah, that and the season. I'm being flippant there, of course, but Abu Kamara, getting his first start today. That's a reward for me. The last 2 seasons, whenever I've watched the development game, he's been a standout. So he's been knocking on the door, proverbial door. David Wagner clearly likes what he sees. Excuse me. So he didn't. To give him his due, he didn't really, impact the game too hugely. But then, he's coming into a very difficult situation. But the mere fact that we saw him on the pitch, I think that's a good signal. And Gibbs as well. I'd like to see a bit more of Liam Gibbs now. And hopefully, once the game is, as it seems to be, up definitively, that we will start to see those players, because there's no doubt that if you're a fan base, and particularly if you're a home fan and you've been to a lot of these Carrow Road affairs, and again, you're leaving potentially early today, they need something. They need something to visibly show them that, okay, we accept it hasn't gone where anybody hoped it was going to go this season, but there is hope, and there are fresh young players who can come in, obviously within the right framework and with the right experience around them, but there is something to cling on to going into that summer. And it's funny because the parallels are, this time last season we were saying something similar about Dean Smith get Johnny Rowe in, and
I'm always a bit wary of this. That we get to we got there a little bit last season.
Yeah, we did,
where it's a bit young players are the saviour again. And
well, I'd stop short of that, but ultimately, in terms of a renewal and a sense of freshness and shedding this idea that it's the tired, tried and trusted who we're going to rely on again, I think it sends signals. I'm not saying they're going to, as Kamara showed today, they're not going to come in and suddenly take the Championship by storm. I think that's unrealistic. Because the backdrop is one of a lot of things need to be, I think, ironed out on and off the park at that football club. So, but it does send positive signals to your fan base that okay, in these type of players there is a little bit of hope that a new era can begin and a new cycle can get underway under David Wagner, because clearly if this season ends anywhere between 7th and 10th, we'll say, in terms of the spread, then for me that should be the end for quite a lot of these players, and that then opens up a whole different kettle of fish about how you actually move players on and
save it.
I know, and the contractual elements of players who are still under contract beyond this summer, but we'll leave that for the summer. I'm not trying to assert that Abu Kamara is.
I know, it's more the narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And, because ultimately, in these last 4 games, his go-tos haven't delivered. And if they're not going to deliver over these next 3 games, particularly, then the game's up. So what's to be lost by exposing some of these younger talents, because they'll be needed next season, that is for sure. Yes,
right. 2 Easter games. I think we're probably not going to record until then, so happy Easter for people listening, watching. They don't read podcasts, so that would be an odd way to go. 6 points available, Sam. First question, how many does Norwich City need?
6.
How many will Norwich City get?
1.
1?
Yeah.
Where's the 1 coming from?
Rotherham. It is Rotherham. Blackburn.
Paddy, same for you.
Well,
how many points does Norwich City need?
Well, they need 6, but I thought I was being slightly tough to say 3, but 1 is.
So okay, how many?
If they walk off, I'm telling you now, if they walk off Easter Monday and they've been beaten at Blackburn and they've only got a point against Rotherham, I think I might have to bring my earmuffs, because I think that could. I'm not saying it'll approach Blackburn home levels of toxicity, and it certainly wouldn't be directed. I don't think.
Wagner got a bit today, didn't he?
Yeah,
but I don't know if it was at him or it was just frustration.
My reading was it was, and it was a small pocket around the snake pit for me.
I felt it was frustration.
I think it was just a frustrated, sort of byproduct of. This game was built up that you were going to have a good go, and they didn't really do that, did they? So I think, and it wasn't just directly at him. I think his players were accompanying him around the pitch, some of his players. But all joking aside, as I say, if it is 1 point from these next 2 games, and then
surely can't be 1 point.
No, I'd be surprised. He's a harsh man, Mr. Seaman. So. But then it could conceivably, because I haven't checked at the wrong end of the table, but Rotherham are right in the thick of it, aren't they?
Are.
What happened I saw it socially yesterday, that game that got called off, has there been some sort of update on that?
Yeah, they've rescheduled it, haven't they? I think Cardiff wanted it replayed because I don't know if you've seen the videos, but there are some very clever Rotherham groundsmen who are pushing water off the pitch and then bring it back on with these wonderfully long brooms. So I think that's going to be rearranged. There's talk that Reading could lose 6 points as well. I think we're kind of waiting to see. I think obviously they want it pushed into next season because they're on 46 at the moment, so they're probably just about there. I think QPR are below them with 42. So
I mean, again, I don't want to say it could be worse, but I mean, when Reading came here just before Christmas, they were not that far off the top end of competing, were they? So they've had a horrendous run.
Norwich City didn't beat them this season. There you go. So there you go. But yeah, it's fascinating, and I think those games as well you can never really take for granted. When you're playing a team near the bottom, they can be more dangerous than playing a team mid-table as well.
Hold on, so we've got 1 point, 3 points. Connor Southwell.
4.
Wow.
4. And I'm going to go for 3 at Ewood Park.
Yeah,
but you can flip those. You can flip those. I'm trying to end it on a bit of optimism and a bit of oomph to.
Oh, Blackburn have lost today, haven't they? They have lost today.
Yeah, I just don't think they're that good.
No.
But those words could come back to haunt me. So
well, they've already beaten Norwich twice. League
yeah,
and
but again, does that mean anything really?
They'll be getting pink.
I'm gonna be clipped up by a load of Blackburn
now.
Yeah, people now. There we go. That's such is life. But I think what I will say is I think they're onto a good thing there with Greg Broughton and John Dale Tomlinson. So I think they're another one. It would probably be a bit too soon if they went this year. What they've done in year one is fairly remarkable. So I think I've backtracked enough there to make it okay. So that's all right. If you obviously this won't mean much if you're listening on audio, but we are recording this podcast. Hopefully, if that phone is still recording, we're in the Utopia room, which is I don't know, comical maybe after what we've just experienced this afternoon. There was water in these mugs. It wasn't. We've got some mugs in front of us with the various news brands. Well, I have water in mine. Paddy did it, so I can't speak for himself, but.
There is some. I won't name the brand, but there is some beer bottles out there. But I know you two are clean living lads, so I thought we'd stick with the water. Yeah,
water. Like having a cold substance in a mug is quite controversial. I think.
I was worried actually that people watching would think how absurd it was for me to be drinking tea that presumably had been sat there for like an hour. I think that would have been fairly rank. So yeah, it's good you've qualified there. Actually, I wouldn't drink cold tea on a slow basis through the podcast.
Favourite biscuit to dunk in a cup of tea?
This has gone well, this podcast. I can think of the Lidl name, but Hobnobs.
They drink half of it though if you lob them in.
Yeah, but I don't mind it. I think that's fine really. But I'm not really a dunker anyway, to be honest.
You're not?
Nah, I don't like soggy things. I think I'd rather.
Brilliant. Pad?
Ginger nut.
Oh, great show.
What are we talking the double stack one with the cream in the middle? Is that a ginger nut? What's that one?
I don't know what that.
They're nice.
An abomination. That's
what
nice
that is.
No. You just need a substantial. If you're going donking, you need a substantial spherical object of a biscuit nature. We'll move on now, Connor.
Custard cream.
Connor didn't give us his favourite.
Custard cream for me.
Custard cream.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're obsessed.
You've got some good options there because you can go for the whole sandwich with a dunk. You can pull them in half.
Yep.
2 dunks.
Are you ever putting them in half and then licking the cream?
No. I'm not an animal. I'm not an animal.
Yeah, I forgot about your love for custard creams. Anyone that hasn't been in the Norwich City press lounge, Connor usually finishes off the custard creams.
Hang on.
All the rest of us that might want some custard creams are denied because
not to go Chris Wilder on you, but you should get there early.
That's true. To be fair, you are there early, so congratulations.
Any more on biscuits, Pat?
No. It's a sad indictment of where Norwich's season is that we've just spent the last 3 minutes talking about biscuits.
This is what happens when you ban talk of a rebuild.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, this is true. That seems like an apt place to leave it anyway. Thank you very much for listening, for watching. If you've done that again, there was lots of nice comments, constructive comments about our video last week. So keep that up. Although it's literally a phone on a tripod and I'm using my phone as a microphone. So we're not working high tech here, but I think it's just about worked, hopefully. So that works well. And of course, audio, hopefully we're coming loud and clear to you. I think we have been. My phone still says it's recording, so that's positive. We will see you at Ewood Park. Have a lovely Easter. What is it people eat at Easter? Is it lamb? Enjoy your lamb and Easter eggs and Easter bunnies and various biscuits. Yeah, absolutely. Have a dunk over Easter and let us know what you have a dunk with, and that seems like an apt place to leave it. So thank you very much for listening and we'll see you again very soon.